Okay, so we know that Stephan Stearns is a big fat liar. But if you've looked at my recent videos where I've looked at Chris and Deb Stearns, I think we could probably presume that they also are quite good at stretching the truth. So there's some statements that were made by Chris and Deb which I find quite curious. Now, we know that the information they're giving is not true. But my question is, did this information come from Stephan, or did they make it up themselves? Now, we've only had one phone call released so far from Stearns in prison between him and his parents. So obviously, I can't say for certain that this is something that they made up themselves. However, there's a few things that point to the possibility that this particular narrative is one that the Stearnses came up with as opposed to Stephan. So I'm going to recap the timeline first, just to clarify things. And then I'm going to go through a few videos and also a few reports from the latest document dump. And from that, see what we can decide. So what I'm specifically looking at in terms of the timeline is Stephan's trip down to Northport. Because Deb and Chris say something quite curious, which at this point all we can take it as is pure hearsay. Whether or not it came from Stephan, there's nothing here to prove that it did as yet. But let's look at the timeline first. So in terms of Stephan being down at Northport, we have him being caught on vehicle tag identification at 6:29, 1 mile from the Stearns' home. And then 5 minutes later, so from 6:34 to 7:09, he was logged into Google at their house, as per FBI cast. So right there is a proof that we need that he was actually in the house. And there's another bit of proof that I'll come back to in a second. And I've actually gone through this quite extensively, so I'm only going to skip through this. But I will point out, people have questioned, well, couldn't he have used the phone that he got off Chris and access Google from outside the house? No. I believe that the reason he went down to Northport was because he had already tried to use Jen's phone to access Google and couldn't because he needed two-step authentication. His phone had been taken, so even if he had Chris's spare phone at that point in time, just trying to access his Google account through Wi-Fi would not have worked for him. And I'm pretty certain he would have known that. So the only option he had was to get on his own computer and try and access Google. Seems that the two-step authentication was still required and that he perhaps could not access the folders that he needed to access. But the other thing with that is that according to Chris, and we've not seen any reports on that particular phone, according to Chris, he only gave that phone to Stephan in the afternoon. But we know here, Stephan was at the house, he was logged into Google at the house for a little over half an hour. We have him then on camera at 7:28. Oh, sorry. That's Chris Stearns. We have him on camera at 7:46, leaving the residence. Now that's actually interesting. I just realised, oh no, that makes sense, because like I said, I believe that he removed the hard drive after he tried to get into Google. So it seems like at 7:09, after failing to get into Google, he's decided to remove the hard drive of his computer instead. That's taken him a little under half an hour. And then he's been caught on camera leaving the area. So that's an important part of the timeline. Now we know also that in terms of the storage units, that he definitely did not go to the storage unit. Unless he somehow managed to scale the fence at the facility and not go in through the gate where you have to put the pin in. But even then, there's no evidence of that. We know that he did not attend the storage facility because, first of all, they made the mistake of believing someone had used Chris's keypad at around 9 o'clock. That's impossible because Stephan was back at Kissimmee at 10:20. In morning traffic, there's no way he could make that trip in an hour and 20 minutes, as opposed to 3 hours. We also know that they proved later that the keypad wasn't actually used. So the storage container is off the table in terms of the timeline, but we do know Stephan was at the house. Now, as I already mentioned, the only audio we have so far in terms of jail phone calls between Stephan and his parents is that one phone call from 13th of May. So I don't know if there were any additional discussions between them regarding Stephan's trip down to Northport, but there was a discussion about his trip to Northport during that May 13th phone call. So I'm going to play that to you to start with, and then we'll go from there.
Is there some explanation of I came up Wednesday morning, met you at the hotel early in the morning, and is there some explanation why you left and went where you went?
I was driving around.
Okay, understood you were driving around, but they know where you were driving around.
Yeah. Well,
And we know.
okay. I had wanted to grab a few things and get my ducks in a row, kind of prepare myself for whatever was coming, but I couldn't find what I was looking for.
So the first thing that you get from this straight away is that Stephan has just admitted to his parents that he was in the house. He said he wanted to grab a few things, but he couldn't find what he was looking for. Well, you can only not find what you're looking for if you're in the location where you are looking for those things, if that makes sense. For him to just go down to Northport and not be able to get into the house, which we know it's not true because we know that he was connected to their IP address. But, to be looking for things and saying, I could not find them, that means you were in the location where you believe they should have been, meaning that he was in the house. But that's kind of more an addendum to the other videos I've done because I only just spotted that there. But basically, he's telling them that is the reason he went down there. He went to get his ducks in a row and prepare himself for what was to come, essentially. And he was looking for something. Now, like I said, we know he was in the house. We know he was attempting to access things on Google. We also know that he removed the hard drive from the computer at that time, and that hard drive went missing. These are all in my previous videos, so jump in and have a look at them later if you want clarification on this. Okay, so I'm going to play another bit of audio which essentially not only clarifies that Stephan had actually been in the house and removed the hard drive, but it also shows that Chris Stern knew that this was the case.
Of course, I learned hours later when Jen called me and go, "Do you know where Stephan is?" I go, "No." What do you mean, where's Stephan? He isn't with you? But I asked him, I said, "Hey, look, there's a desktop computer at home. Maybe you guys should come get it." He said, "Okay, we'll make arrangements to do that," only to find out that the hard drive was removed from it. I know it was there Sunday morning when he left, because I told the police that after I found that out. So he purposely removed that hard drive. Why?
So he makes it really clear here. He is discussing the hard drive. He's discussing handing over the tower to the police and discovering that it didn't have a hard drive in it. And he specifically says, "I know that it was in there on the morning when he left." And he's basically saying that he knows that the hard drive was in there before Stephan left to go to Kissimmee, and that Stephan had then subsequently removed the hard drive. How could he subsequently remove the hard drive? The only possibility there is for him to have done so when he was at their house in that period, that window of an hour and a quarter. So he had, like I said, roughly half an hour from when he stopped trying to get into Google till when he was next seen on that camera. And you know that when he was first seen on camera, it took him 5 minutes to be onto that computer. So it wouldn't take him half an hour to get off the computer and end up in the same location. So he definitely did something between when he stopped trying to get into Google, or whatever it was he was doing there, and left the premises. So according to the timeline, that all fits. That is the only period of time that he possibly could have removed the hard drive. And Chris Stearns essentially admits to that here. And we know that this is something that comes up in several different interviews. And it comes up in the interviews that I'm also going to play excerpts from later on in this video. So as you listen to the narrative, as Chris puts it, keep in mind that, first of all, we know the timeline. We know Stephan went down to Northport to do something on Google and to remove that hard drive. We also know that Chris Stearns knew that for a fact. He actually discussed that with officers after they had checked out the hard drive. And I believe it was in this same interview that I'm just about to play part of. So let's move on to that.
Yeah, okay. Weird. Because like I said, and as Debbie shared, she said the dogs went on full alert around 5 something, but anything could have spooked him, but definitely he wasn't in Northport at that time, so it's just curious as to why. I don't know if he tried to I don't know if he tried to come to the house and maybe the dogs didn't go on full alert because he again talked about getting access to his guns. And then he could have accessed a couple of other guns he had at the house.
But he had one gun with him. So any reason why he would want his other guns?
So first of all, I'm not sure if that officer was confused or the detective was confused, or if he was trying to play Chris's game. Because like I said, Chris knows in this interview that Stephan had removed the hard drive. You hear it being discussed in this interview. So for him to then speculate that Stephan went down to the house, that he couldn't possibly have got into the house, and that he wonders if Stephan went down to remove the guns, is a bit of a change from the original narrative. It also doesn't fit with the story that we've heard Stephan tell them, in terms of Stephan went down looking for a few things, went to grab a few things, couldn't find them, went to get his ducks in a row. You could say that he could have been referring to trying to find his guns, but there's more audio which will show that that's not the case, because Chris actually says that he believes that Stephan wanted the guns to unalive himself, whereas it sounds pretty clear from this that that's not the goal that Stephan had. But aside from all that, we know that Stephan didn't outright say there that that's what he was doing. So Stephan did not once mention guns in that discussion. This is the first time we've heard suggestion of Stephan wanting to go down to Northport to access his guns. Now, the reason I said the officer must have either been confused or trying to play along with Chris's game is that, if you remember, that was the night when they were in the hotel, and the apartment where Jen lives and where Stephan had been visiting was basically sealed because they were going to execute a search warrant the following morning. And at that point in time, that's where Stephan's gun was. So he actually didn't have another gun on him. So you could say, well, okay, maybe it is plausible that he went down there to collect another gun because his gun was locked in the house. But unless we have him saying that on a recording, where's the evidence of that? Now, he could have said it to them on another phone call as an excuse for heading down to Northport. We don't know that. Or it could be that they've realised that he accessed the house. They've realised that he removed evidence and destroyed evidence, and they're trying to find a plausible explanation for him going down to Northport that doesn't mention him getting the hard drive. Because don't forget too, at this point in time, this decoy hard drive that Chris has handed over, Chris now knows that they know that that wasn't actually accessed for nearly 4 years. So the whole storage unit story has gone out the window, and if you've listened to my other videos, it sounded like Chris was trying very hard to use that as a distraction from the fact that Stephan went to the house. So I'm wondering if, with the storage unit story having gone out the window, that the Stephan went down to access guns story is the new distraction from Stephan actually going down to remove evidence. So I'm going to play some more audio.
They said that the report said that they left Kissimmee at 3:18 and went down to St. Cloud and spent 30 minutes and then returned.
Yes. They did.
Okay,
So-
I'm assuming they departed from the townhouse?
No.
Oh, okay. I'm just,
No, they left from the hotel.
oh, okay. 3:18. Okay, so 45 minutes later after checking in. Got it. Does any footage show that they both went or just one?
Just him.
Just him. I asked him about that, and which was would have been on the recorded phone call, why he did that, and he said that he was speculating killing himself.
Okay, now that one bit of audio actually proves that Chris Stearns is a really bad liar. And I hope the detectives actually listened back over that and picked up on what actually happened there during that conversation. Now, there is some confusion here in that Chris Stearns has got it in his head that the trip that Stephan did returning to where he left Maddie was the same night as the night that he went down to Northport, and we know that's not the case. He went back to where Maddie was the night before that when they were still in the apartment. So that's why it sounds a little bit confusing. But he relates that, and this is the July interview, where to me it sounded like he was fishing for information from the police. Now, he brings it up. He says, look, there's this camera footage, there's all this documentation saying that he or they returned to essentially the location where Maddie was at this particular time. And he questions them, do you have camera evidence that it was both of them? So essentially he's saying, can you nab Jen for going with Stephan back to where Maddie was? And they say, no, it was just Stephan. And suddenly he changes the narrative from giving the impression that he believed that it was Jen and Stephan that had returned to Maddie, and then being told that it was only Stephan. He then says, Stephan spoke to me about that, and he said that he returned there because he was considering to unalive himself. Can you see the flaw with this? Basically, he's changed the story without realising that logically it doesn't fit. Because if he believed that Jen and Stephan had both gone there, which is what he's implying at first, why would he believe that they would both go there if Stephan was planning to unalive himself? If he has supposedly discussed it with Stephan and Stephan has said that, then he would know already that Stephan had gone there on his own. But clearly he didn't know that Stephan had gone there on his own because he was asking them if they had on camera, and he's saying they went there. It's come out that they went there. And have you got them on camera? So in his head, he was convinced at the start of this conversation that Jen and Stephan had both gone back to visit Maddie. Then when he's told that it was only Stephan, suddenly he comes up with this notion of Stephan going there to unalive himself. There is a major disconnect here in the narrative. Because if Stephan had told him that, he would have already known that Stephan had gone there on his own. Hopefully I'm making sense there. I'm not sure how else to explain that to clarify. But if Stephan was planning on unaliving himself, he would not have gone there with Jen. Chris Stearns is a pretty savvy man. He's pretty switched on. So had Stephan told him that he was planning on going there to do that, Chris Stearns never in a million years would have presumed that Jen was with him. So I think this is where we first hear the narrative suggesting that Stephan had this notion of unaliving himself. But we know that it is a lie from Chris, because he's just basically changed the narrative mid-stride. So with that in mind, let's head back down to Northport.
Well, because he said, I went to get the guns because I was considering killing myself. And so now that makes sense. He would have come down to Northport to try to get into the house to get the guns. And maybe he came up to the house and found out he couldn't get into the house. The dogs didn't go on full alert. And so that makes sense. So that's probably what he was doing. Again, kind of confirming his comment about wanting to get the guns. So he only had the one at the townhouse, which didn't make sense, but now coming down to Northport to do that would make sense. Long way to go for nothing.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So supposedly, the night before his trip to Northport, when he made the trip to Maddie, Stephan had been considering unaliving himself, and at that point in time he did have access to a gun. But we know that's a load of BS coming from Chris, and that Stephan probably never said that. Well, we know that Stephan never said that, because Chris was originally pushing the narrative that Jen was with Stephan when he returned to see Maddie. When that narrative got shot to pieces, he needed to change the narrative, and he said, well, Stephan told me that he went there because he was considering unaliving himself. And then further on in this same conversation, he suddenly comes up with this idea of, well, he must have gone down to Northport to get hold of the guns, because he told me that he considered unaliving himself, but I know that he couldn't get into the house. Chris knows that this is a lie. Whether this lie comes from Chris or whether it comes from Stephan, it is a lie, because Chris knows at this point in time when he's having this conversation that Stephan did get into the house. Stephan did remove the hard drive and dispose of it. So to come up with this story about him must have gone down there to get the guns, it's BS. And I'm actually going to suggest that it is purely and simply Chris Stearns' BS. Like I said, unless there are audio recordings that come out that show this conversation occurring between Chris and Stephan, the only thing we have from Stephan is that he wanted to go down and grab a few things and get his ducks in a row. He did not say anything in that conversation about wanting to go down and collect his guns and unalive himself. So as far as we know, that topic was not brought up between them. And it just seems that given that Chris introduced that topic earlier in the same conversation, where he switched from suggesting that the trip to go back to Maddie was both Jen and Stephan, and then switched the narrative to, well, Stephan said he went back there because he wanted to unalive himself. That to me suggests that this is a narrative that Chris has come up with in his head, on the spot, running with basically the conversation where Stephan said he needed to retrieve something from the house, and Chris has gone, well, this is a convenient one to use. Now, I am going to go through a few documents which I think are also kind of interesting and just point towards this whole thing a little bit more. Now, in various interviews, you have Deb Stearns saying that essentially when Chris isn't there, the house is locked up like Fort Knox. And you have Chris Stearns saying there's no way that Stephan could have gained access to the house. I mean, we know that as a lie. So let's just make that clear. But here's the thing that I found really interesting. So this was the interview on the 28th of February that was done with Deb while Chris Stearns was still up at Orlando. And one of the things that was said here, Deborah believed that if Stephan returned to their residence, that he either returned to collect his firearms or for cash that was kept within the home by her and Christopher. Deborah advised that she retrieved and secured 2 handguns and a rifle from Stephan's room and secured them inside her bedroom last evening. Now, this is after she claimed she was awoken by the dogs at exactly 3:19. So here it seems that she quite clearly believes that her son was more than capable of entering the house. And she's claiming that she was that concerned that she actually retrieved guns from Stephan's room. If you believe that your house is locked up like Fort Knox and that nobody can get in, why do you need to go and retrieve handguns from the room? To me, it doesn't make sense. Something isn't adding up here. But this is the first mention of any kind of guns. On the 28th, so this is around the time that Stephan is being arrested. Is this the beginning of the narrative of Stephan heading back down to the house to retrieve his guns to unalive himself? We know that that wasn't his intention. And I mean, face it, Stephan Stearns is such a gutless wonder that that would be the last thing on his mind. So I can't even imagine that he would come up with that as an excuse, to be quite honest. To me, I believe that this narrative of him heading down there to get the guns to unalive himself comes directly from Deb and Chris, and this is where it originates. Like I said, we can't know for certain until we have accessed other prison phone calls or documents relating to the other prison phone calls. But we do know that from the phone call that we have heard, that all that he said to them was that he wanted to find a few things, get his ducks in a row. Never once did he say he wanted to find his guns and he wanted to unalive himself. So is this, where is this narrative coming from? Whoever made up the narrative, we know that it is a lie regardless. Because we know why Stephan went back to the house. We know that he went there, he accessed Google, he removed the hard drive, he left. Is that the action of someone who was going to unalive themselves? You wouldn't give a rat's ass about that. You would go, you would look for the guns, you'd see they weren't there, you'd probably come up with a plan B. But his intent was to destroy evidence. If you're planning on unaliving yourself, you don't give a rat's ass about evidence. So, once again, back to the question of who made up this story. I'm leaning towards this story having actually originated with Deb and Chris. And here's my belief as to why that could have occurred. I don't believe that Deb and Chris would have helped their son had they known that he was in a serious legal situation. I believe that they thought they were just getting him out of a small mess yet again. That basically, at the time that Stephan told them Maddie was missing, he came up with something to tell them that made it look like because at the time that he was speaking to them, when Chris actually went from Northport to Orlando, we know that the apartment had been locked down. Stephan's phone had been taken. Stephan's car had been taken. So we know that Chris knew that when he went to Orlando. Now, he may have believed that Stephan was completely innocent, but I'm guessing that since they were supposedly quite switched on to their son, they figured that there was something going on here. I believe that Stephan probably came up with some kind of story that made him look like he'd done something stupid, but that he had nothing to do with Maddie going missing, and that he certainly hadn't done anything that was, hugely illegal like what he had done. Perhaps he suggested that there might have been emails between him and Maddie that made him look bad or something. I don't know, but I think that whatever happened, he played down the situation to his parents to the point where they decided to step in again and help clear up his mess, not knowing what sort of mess they were actually stepping in to clear up. And I think subsequently, having discovered exactly what kind of mess he was in, they've had to cover their asses, and they've had to come up with excuses for things that they did to hide the fact that they did them. I have said before that I wouldn't be surprised if Deb Stearns actually knew that Stephan was in the house at the time that he was in the house. Maybe she even let him into the house, I'm not sure. But I believe that they both knew that Stephan had entered the house. We know that at the time when Chris is bringing up this notion of Stephan entering the house to retrieve his guns, we know that Chris knows that Stephan had gone there to remove the hard drive and had done so. So was this narrative something that Chris and Deb concocted between them? Deb originally saying that she believed that had Stephan entered the house, he would have been after his guns. And then Chris, knowing that she'd said that, ran with that after finding out that Jen and Stephan were not together returning to Maddie, that it was only Stephan who did that. And him reacting to that came up with this narrative about Stephan. Yeah, he went back to where Maddie was because he was going to unalive himself. Liked his story, and then decided that was also a good reason for him to have gone down to Northport. Or did Stephan actually say this to them at some point in time? And is this something that is going to come out later through future FOIA requests? I'll let you decide what you think. Leave your thoughts below. Tell me what you think. Which way are you leaning? Do you think this is something concocted by Chris based on Deb's original statement? Or do you think this is something that Stephan had said to them? That big slip up though for me is the cruncher. Chris changing the narrative from believing that Stephan and Jen had gone together, and then when he's told that no, the cameras showed that it was only Stephan, him saying, well, Stephan actually told me, meaning that he should have known that it wasn't Stephan and Jen together. Anyway, if you've stuck with me this long, thank you so much for listening in. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe. Also, please hit the like button, and please do leave a comment below. Thanks, and I'll catch you in the next one.